Hi everybody, thank you for tuning in to today's Read Aloud. I hope you're all doing well. I'm going to continue reading Esio Trot that we left off with on Friday, but before we start, let me give you a little recap and read the synopsis on the back here. Remember, this story is about an ancient spell, 140 tortoises, and a little bit of magic. Mr. Hoppy is in love with his neighbor, Mrs. Silver, but she is in love with someone else. Alfie, her pet tortoise. With all her attention focused on Alfie, Mrs. Silver doesn't even know Mr. Hoppy is alive, and Mr. Hoppy is too shy to even ask Mrs. Silver over for tea. Then, one day, Mr. Hoppy comes up with a brilliant idea to get Mrs. Silver's attention. If Mr. Hoppy's plan works, Mrs. Silver will certainly fall in love with him. After all, everyone knows the way to a woman's heart is through her tortoise. So when we were reading, Mr. Hoppy had begun his plan, and that was to get 140 tortoises. What do you think his plan is going to be, and do you think it will work? Let's read a little bit more to find out. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make lots of trips, and he was quite exhausted at the end of it all, but it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it! And what an amazing sight his living room was when they were all in there together! The floor was swarming with tortoises of different size, some walking slowly about and exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, and others drinking water from a big, shallow dish. Take a look at all those tortoises. They made just the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet, but that was all. Mr. Hoppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes, this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that. He must get on with the job. Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. Let's look at this contraption he's putting together. First, he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and then he attached this to an end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down inside the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed, and when you pushed them, the claws would open. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So on the first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You are about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the 2 claws neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like 2 fingers of a hand, and he hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy. Take a look. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct, and it was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that first of all had the same color shell as Alfie's, and secondly, weighed exactly 2 ounces more. Do you remember why 2 ounces was important? 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoises, they were bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice it. Do you think she'll notice? From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more and no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by just 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. And we'll read more to find out what happens. But first, Yoshi says hi. Bye, guys.